Welcome to The Explainer. So what happens when a genuinely curious skeptic sits down with a theologian to ask all the toughest questions about Christianity? Well, today we're going to distill that exact conversation, following the journey of someone really testing the foundations of faith in our modern world.
You know, in what a lot of people call an increasingly secular world, something pretty unexpected is going on. The data is pointing to this renewed interest in the Christian faith. I mean, Bible sales are hitting a 2-decade high. Readership is up. Even Christian music is surging. So, what's going on here? What's behind this search for something more?
Well, it doesn't seem to be just a random trend. It looks like a direct response to a much deeper hunger in our society. A lot of scholars are pointing to this widespread crisis of meaning, this kind of profound sense of purposelessness that leaves a lot of people feeling isolated and, just adrift.
Okay, so let's trace this whole journey. We're going to follow the skeptic's line of questioning, starting with that modern search for meaning. Then we'll dig into the reliability of the Bible, tackle the supernatural claim of the resurrection, face the really deep problem of evil, and finally get to the ultimate search for why.
All right, first up, why now? What is driving this search? It seems like there are two big shifts at play here. First, that really aggressive anti-religious new atheism movement from the early 2000s has kind of faded away. And at the same time, this intense focus on the self has left a lot of us feeling a spiritual and community-shaped hole in our lives.
Yeah, as those traditional community bonds, family, local groups, that sort of thing, as they've weakened, we've just become more isolated. And a lot of people are really struggling with that. Sociologists even have a name for it, the dynamics of disenchantment. It's this deep search for something transcendent in a world that can feel, purely material.
And that search inevitably leads the skeptic to the first major roadblock, the Bible itself. I mean, how can we possibly trust a collection of documents written thousands of years ago by people from a pre-scientific ancient culture?
The immediate, and let's be honest, very logical objection is that our memories are just terrible. The Gospels, for example, they were written maybe 40 to 60 years after the events they describe. Isn't that just a historical game of telephone waiting to happen?
But this is where the theologian pushes back, arguing that the game of telephone analogy is just completely wrong. See, that game is designed to mess up the message. But in contrast, ancient oral cultures, which relied on memory for everything, had the exact opposite goal. They built in all these social mechanisms to preserve stories with as much accuracy as possible. In fact, historians actually look for specific things that guard against what they call mythological drift, that tendency for stories to get bigger and crazier over time. And the early Christians didn't make their claims in some far-off land. They proclaimed the resurrection right there in Jerusalem, the scene of the crime. They even named living witnesses in their accounts, basically saying, hey, don't believe us, go ask them yourselves. That created a super high-stakes environment where accuracy was everything.
Okay, but even if the historical transmission was reliable, that just leads us to the biggest claim of all, the one that jumps from history straight into the supernatural.
So, what is the actual case for the resurrection? This is the absolute linchpin of the entire Christian faith. For any skeptic, this is the highest possible bar. It's the make-or-break claim, really. If this falls, the whole thing falls. The case presented isn't about one single piece of slam-dunk proof, but about some really powerful circumstantial evidence. The argument goes like this. What could possibly explain the radical transformation of Jesus' disciples? These guys went from hiding in fear for their lives to boldly proclaiming his resurrection, even when it got them killed. And why would the early accounts list women, whose testimony was basically worthless in that culture, as the very first eyewitnesses? That's a detail you just wouldn't invent if you were trying to sell a story.
But even if a person can find a way to accept the history and even the supernatural claims, there still may be the most difficult question of all. And this one isn't just intellectual, it's deeply personal, it's emotional.
And there it is, the argument from suffering that just stumps so many people. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, why does he allow such horrific, pointless-seeming suffering in the world? It's a question that cuts right to the heart of God's character.
This challenge, of course, has a formal name, the problem of evil. And for centuries, it's been considered the most serious, most powerful objection to the existence of the God described in the Bible.
And this really highlights the two core ways of looking at this problem. From a purely materialist point of view, our sense of evil is just an evolutionary trick to help us survive. But the theologian counters that argument by saying, wait a minute, the very act of calling something evil means you believe in an objective standard of good. And if a universal moral law like that exists, well, where did it come from?
So, after grappling with history, with miracles, and with this deep problem of morality, we come full circle. We're right back at the original question that drove this entire search. What is the answer to the crisis of meaning?
To explain the Christian answer, the theologian in this dialogue uses a really simple parable. So, meet Betty. She's a brilliant botanist who spends her weekend meticulously analyzing a plant specimen in her lab. She understands it completely, on a purely scientific level.
But on Monday, her assistant reveals the truth. It was a Valentine's Day rose. You see, Betty understood every single scientific detail about the rose, but she had completely missed its meaning. The scientific data alone could never give her the why.
And here's the crucial point. Christianity proposes that the universe and every single person in it isn't just a collection of data, a specimen to be analyzed. It proposes that it and you were created with intention, with purpose, that you are, in essence, a love gift.
And that leaves us with a final, really provocative thought that kind of frames this entire debate. When you look at the world, when you look at your own life, what do you see? A biological specimen, just the product of time, matter, and chance? Or do you see a love gift, something that's filled with a purpose that goes way beyond what science alone can ever measure?